leadership, one of the great historical concepts, an area of study that has stood the test of time and been analyzed really since the beginning of what we can call history. So if we can say anything about history, we can say that leadership matters. But leadership is also one of the great buzzwords of the social media age. We probably don't have to think too hard to find terrible leaders in high places in our society, or even bad leaders on a smaller scale in our personal lives who have affected us in some way. Over the last decade or so, we've all been flooded with everyone from influencers to online trolls, professors, politicians, podcasters, human resource people, financial gurus, corporate tech leaders, all seeking to stake a claim on what leadership is and why it matters. And oftentimes there are huge financial, historical, and political consequences at stake in this struggle over what real leadership is. So in today's episode, I'm joined by historian Martin Gutmann to talk about leadership from a historical perspective. Martin is a historian, author, and professor at the Lucerne School of Business at Lucerne University of Applied Sciences and Arts in Switzerland. He has published 3 books and over 24 academic articles on subjects including leadership, sustainability, international relations, and negotiations in a historical context. His latest book is called The Unseen Leader: How History Can Help Us Rethink Leadership. In this episode, Martin and I discuss what leadership is, why it matters, how leadership connects to the human story, and we look at some historical examples. We take a look at the myth of Hitler as an effective leader, compare Hitler with Winston Churchill as far as wartime leaders, take a look at Churchill's leadership as well as the Haitian Revolution and Toussaint l'Ouverture. We talk about Gertrude Bell and the post-World War I Middle East, and we also look at some overall historical takeaways and lessons in leadership. I really enjoyed this one, and I hope you do as well. Thanks for listening. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. I love the show. I've been listening for some time, not to every episode, but to many of them. And yeah, you do a really nice job.
Well, thank you. That means a lot coming from somebody who knows what they're talking about.
That's nice of you to say.
Maybe we could get going.
Yeah, totally.
I like to start a lot of these interviews. This is interesting for me, but I'd like to know what your background is as far as what got you into history, what sort of got you interested in the subject, and what led you to want to become a historian, and then what were the types of things you studied, and then how did that lead into history and leadership together. I know that's a lot, so I'll kind of just throw all that at you and see how it goes.
Well, I ended up studying history kind of by default. I started college not knowing exactly what I wanted to do nor what I wanted to study. And a few years into it, I think it was a year, 2.5 or 3, when you have to declare a major, I realized that the only major I could declare that would allow me to graduate on time would be history. So somehow I gravitated towards history and political science classes. They were the most interesting to me. And then I just stayed in that track, got a master's degree and a PhD. And by that point, so this was in 2010 that I graduated from the PhD program. I knew that I wanted to work with history. I wanted to teach and write about history, but it wasn't necessarily clear to me that I wanted to be employed by university as a professor. So that also kind of evolved later throughout various experiences that I had. Looking back on my childhood, I mean, I didn't really think of being a historian as a professor, and I certainly didn't consider what I wanted to study once I got to university, but I was always interested in stories. And when I saw like documentaries or had history in elementary and high school, I always wondered about the people. So, very often history is taught in kind of this timeline fashion, French Revolution and the First World War. And I always wondered what was it like for people who lived through that? What were their experiences like? And I really had this desire to understand that. So early on, I tried to read a lot about individual experiences that people had who lived through these things. So maybe that's where my, you know, interest in later studying history first crystallized.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's one of my interests too, is stories and narratives, and how a lot of history, depends on the perspective that you're looking at it from, and the story that is being told by the various people involved. And that, now that you say that, I realized when I was a kid I loved stories, but it was never, it's like you said, it was never like, oh, I want to go into history when I get older. You just like a good story. So what got you into leadership, and why do you think the the concept of leadership has become such a big deal? For me, I can't open social media without some sort of leadership related thing, whether it's a psychology thing, neuroscience, just social media influencers, politicians, the school systems. Everybody seems to be interested in leadership. So what brought you there, and how do you think about leadership?
I think you're spot on. I mean, leadership is one of those concepts everybody talks about, everybody writes about, everybody wants to be involved in. And I think that's been true for some time. It has a bit more staying power than a lot of the other concepts that are traded on LinkedIn and other platforms. I think in the past 10 years plus, leadership has been around. Why is it such a hot topic these days and in the past decade? I have a couple of theories. I don't know that any of them are actually correct. So one is that I think there was a period of relative stability in business and geopolitics um, from the end of the Cold War through, let's say, 2000 plus minus. And then suddenly we both had these major disruptions in the area of business with mobile phones and a bunch of other kind of technologies that really changed and could overnight essentially bankrupt these legacy companies that had been around forever. And the same is true in the geopolitical realm. If we look around just today, there's more things going on, more threats. It's more ambiguous than things were 2 decades ago. And so while I think leadership is always necessary and always an interesting component, it becomes more pressing when there are harder choices to make, when you can't rely on tried and true structures or ways of doing things. So that's one. I think the other is that in the working world, there is a growing emphasis, and I would say this is a very good thing, a growing emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion, on making work compatible for women and parents in general, on cultivating work-life balance, on bringing purpose into work. And all of these efforts, I think, also require leaders who can, you know, tell a story around that, who can actually change a corporate culture, which again is, if you're just a regular old company in the 1980s where these things don't matter, you can just manage your way through, and there's less of a need for a leader to make hard decisions, to stand up and speak and kind of show the way on these efforts. And the third reason I would say is that leadership is aspirational. I think if you're an accountant, you probably want to be good at your job. But I don't know many accountants who want on their tombstone or want their legacy to be, I was the best accountant ever. But leadership is one of these things that we all want to be remembered for, right? We want to be the person who made the right call, who motivated other people. So it's something all of us, or many of us, desire, and that makes it so interesting to study. Right. So these are the three reasons I would come up with off the top of my head. We'd have to, maybe conduct a more rigorous study to find out what's really going on. But certainly, leadership is extremely popular these days.
Yeah, I think those are very interesting theories. You alluded to the idea of when there's turbulence or disturbances or when times are tough, that is when leadership is most needed. And that seems like a pretty basic idea. But if you look historically, a lot of the earliest histories we have are stories of leaders, right? And oftentimes this gets criticized, perhaps as it should, as, sort of great man history or only focusing on leaders. But when you think of it from the perspective that you just sort of offered there, it kind of makes sense that a lot of these histories are being written during some of these turbulent times. And if we can say anything, we can say at least people thousands of years ago cared about leadership as well. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been including that stuff in their stories and in their narratives. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
No, I think it does. And I I do think comparisons to ancient history or any pre-modern history gets a bit tricky simply because you had much more rigid hierarchical social structures where leaders were born into their roles and also didn't have the need to, you know, motivate their followers and justify their leadership role the way you do today in most leadership roles. Um, but certainly, yeah. I mean, humans are, we're a social animal. We need to cooperate in order to survive and thrive. And any cooperation, by definition, necessitates some form of leadership, right? Especially when it's a larger group that's cooperating or when the problem that is being solved is more complex. So I think leadership is a fundamental part of the human story.
speaking of fundamental parts of the human story, you spend a lot of time in your book talking about what you call the action fallacy. So it seems like wherever you go, you're going to have that leader that kind of overdoes it and talks loud and talks a lot and tries to do things, even though those things may not be productive. So maybe you could define the action fallacy for the audience and talk about some of the problems with thinking this way in terms of leadership.
Absolutely. And maybe I'll start by answering the first part of your previous question, which I think I skirted around a bit. So, how did I, as a historian, get interested in leadership? Through a series of quirks that I think define many of our careers, mine included. I ended up teaching at business schools very early on in my career and have done so now for the past decade. And as soon as I was in this MBA business school environment, of course, I started being bombarded with leadership in the research projects that my colleagues were undertaking and the various courses that I was teaching. And for many of the students, this is the thing they want. They want to become better leaders. And so I started reading up on it and noticed that the historical perspective is actually very popular in leadership studies. And I was very, very interested to see that. But often, not always, but often, how these historical characters are written about in these more contemporary leadership works um, doesn't necessarily align with how historians see these past events unfolding. So, let's say Churchill or Napoleon or JFK, these are very popular case studies or personalities that you see profiled in contemporary leadership books and blogs and teaching material. But they're talked about in a way that professional historians would not. And my explanation for this is what I then came to call the action fallacy, which is this mistaken belief that the best leaders were those who created the most noise and action and kind of survived the most dramatic circumstances. And that doesn't correspond to history as I learned it as a historian, because very often the most influential individuals were those who were able to avoid crisis or dramatic circumstances. And even when there was a crisis, certainly reacting quickly and responding is occasionally necessary. But if that's your only method of leading, you're not going to get as far as somebody who's also kind of very competent behind the scenes, who can build structures that are appropriate for the problem at hand, who can create kind of a culture within their team or their organization. And all of these skills are kind of overlooked if we just focus at these very loud, very brash individuals.
While you were talking there, that the old Taoist saying that when the master governs, the people are not aware he exists, kind of struck me there. And speaking of the action fallacy, I wanted to get your thoughts on something that bothers me a little bit, which is, and I think it might bother you as well, because you mentioned it in your book a few times, but when people talk about leadership in history, the first name they bring up a lot of the time is Hitler. And there seems to be a sentiment in the general public that Hitler was a very effective leader. So obviously, I don't think any of these people, think the things Hitler did were good or anything like that. Although I may question, for some of these people, their motivations and underlying philosophies that might lead them to think Hitler was an effective leader. But you might get this sentiment that Hitler was an effective leader, but he was a bad guy. And they might point to his ability to sort of build a movement and, be in charge of this unprecedented rise of a powerful entity. And they might point to that type of stuff as sort of evidence. So I know in your work as a historian, you've examined the terrible crimes of Nazi Germany and Hitler, including the Holocaust and his personal responsibility in those events. And I know that we both think, in addition to being an evil person, Hitler was actually, from strictly a leadership perspective, a pretty terrible leader as well. So if you were just looking at that leadership perspective, what would you say to someone who has that sentiment that despite being evil, he may have been an effective leader?
It is a sentiment that I hear quite often as well, or am asked about quite often. And in some ways, it surprises me, because I think most historians who study the Third Reich are pretty unanimous in the conclusion that he was a very ineffective leader, that Germany descended more and more into a state of chaos, certainly once the war started, and that its war effort, they managed to keep their war effort going for as long as they did, not because of Hitler, but despite his efforts. Right? There was a very competent military class that often circumvented his orders or found ways of ignoring them, which is behind many of the early victories that the Wehrmacht was able to achieve. What we can say about Hitler is that he was a very effective propagandist. Right? He was a good communicator. He was a great storyteller. And that, I think, is what enabled him to have the electoral success in the early 1930s, and also gain some popularity early on. Right? He knew how to talk to the people and promise them things that they wanted and sell them on a vision, a violent and a vile vision, but nonetheless, he was able to sell this to a large part of the German people. But once things got tough with the war, he was a very, very ineffective leader. A lot of historians use the term polyocracy to refer to this, the multiple centers of competing power that you have within the German state, that results in a lot of waste, a lot of infighting, and a lot of policies not being enacted the way the regime actually wanted them to. And where things worked, it's not because of Hitler very often, but because they were very competent and motivated underlings who made it their job to see these things through. There's a very famous scene in the movie Downfall. I don't know if you've seen this. Was You should. It's my favorite movie from the Second World War period. It came out in about 2004, I think. And Bruno Ganz, a Swiss actor who died just a few years ago, he plays Hitler, and I think is also the best adaptation of Hitler that I've seen. And it chronicles the last few days in the bunker in Berlin as the Red Army is encircling, the German capital. The war is essentially over. Hitler has these daily meetings with his generals where he is just shouting at them and ordering them to counterattack with these armies that are only armies on paper at this point. They don't really exist. And the generals tried to tell him this, and he just ignores the reality. And I think this is in many ways how he ruled. He believed that if he shouted loudly enough, if people wanted something badly enough, then they could also make it happen. But of course, that only goes so far. If there's no actual army there, or they don't have any bullets left, there's not really much they can do, no matter how much he shouts about it.
Yes, and this is also something that you discuss, but I think Hitler was a fairly close-minded individual as far as he had his beliefs, and he had his way of looking at the world, which was Nazism or fascism. And I think something that a lot of people miss is that, and you point this out, I forget exactly how you phrase it, but you said that fascism is not responsible for starting World War II. Fascism is World War II, as in that way of thinking about the world, and the overarching philosophy of fascism to begin with is necessarily going to lead to war, because it rests on all these inherent dominance philosophies and the strong over the weak. And there's sort of a short-term thinking there that doesn't factor in a lot of different factors. And I think people miss this with Hitler when they see all of the organizational stuff he does, and the loud speeches and the storytelling. But the story itself is necessarily going to lead to total disaster, which of course it does. So maybe I could throw that at you and see if you could sharpen it up, maybe.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There is some debate as to whether or not Hirohito's Japan should be considered fascist or not. But regardless, what is true both in Japan and Italy and Germany is this belief, and this is a core belief from Mussolini and Hitler, that violence is not a necessary evil or an unfortunate, part of human history. It is a redemptive exercise. It is something that should be glorified and that nations should be engaged in perpetually, because it is only through violence and war that they, stay sharp. Mussolini has this famous quote where he says, war is to a man what maternity, what being a mother is to women. And so you're right. If that is your belief, and it really was, I don't think this was just propaganda. These regimes will sooner or later seek out war, which of course is exactly what they do. And interestingly, one of the first people to recognize the implication of this is Winston Churchill. You have Neville Chamberlain and a lot of other British politicians who believe that you can negotiate with Hitler and with Mussolini. If you give them some of the things that they want, they will, back off and be happy. And Churchill and a few other people recognized early on that, that's not going to happen. They will never stop. And I think that is one of the ways in which, we see in Churchill somebody who understood the currents of history, the time that he was in, better than many others.
Yeah, so maybe we could jump to Churchill, you have a whole section about him in your book, and obviously we should probably do the necessary prerequisites where we mention that Churchill has a lot of problematic things in his history, and there's a lot of colonialism and questions about how responsible he was for a lot of suffering and death, even. But as far as this narrow realm of maybe comparing him to Hitler, as far as leaders during wartime of massive, empires, it's kind of, it's not even close. It's like Michael Jordan versus Ron Harper at the Chicago Bulls practices. I mean, it's crazy. So what would you account, or what would you sort of attribute Churchill's leadership success in winning, helping to win the war?
Well, I appreciate your introductory statement because I think that is very important. In looking at Churchill's leadership role in the Second World War, I and many other people are not suggesting that he is somebody who should be placed on a pedestal or celebrated for his achievements throughout his lifetime, because, as you said, he was involved in many of the most problematic episodes of British imperialism, certainly in the 20th century. With that said, and the book I wrote is a book about leadership. He is more than anyone else. He's not solely, but he's more than anyone else the architect of the Allied victory in the Second World War. And that makes him an interesting person to examine in terms of leadership, because the Second World War, of course, is one of the most complex and one of the deadliest events in human history, certainly in the modern period. So I think he is somebody worth examining. Certainly, if people are already examining Hitler and assuming that he is a good leader with a flawed vision, which we've already discussed, then Churchill, it makes sense to examine Churchill as well. Churchill's interesting too because a lot has been written about his role in the Second World War, and I think some of this work overemphasizes his rhetoric ability, his speeches. It kind of falls in line with his action fallacy. In this case, assuming that because he gave these brilliant speeches and motivated people, Britain was then able to fight for its survival. And while those speeches certainly were brilliant, it doesn't explain the great success that Great Britain had, not only in fighting off Germany in 1940, but in actually leading a coalition that defeated and vanquished Nazism and fascism from the continent. So how did he do that? It's complex, of course, but there's two things that I think are critical. One is that he reorganizes the British government and military machinery in a way that makes it fit to prosecute a modern war. And he does this in a way that no other nation is quite able to do. The US comes close, but Germany certainly does not, right? The integration of science, the integration of propaganda, the integration of these mass mobilized people. So you have both masses of humans working with complex technologies. There's huge strategic questions. So he's able to design an apparatus, a government apparatus that can handle this and make good decisions. Doesn't mean that all the decisions they make are good, but in general, they are. And the second thing is Churchill recognizes very early on that the only way to win the war is to, in his own words, drag the US in. And he makes this one of his priorities. This is a bit hard to spot if you just look at his speeches. He hints at this there, but you really have to look at what he does behind the scenes. And he sets in motion a massive and very deliberate campaign of trying to lure the US or involve the US ever more in the war. And obviously, Pearl Harbor helps because the US then declares war on Japan and Germany all in one. But of course, Pearl Harbor was the attack of the Japanese imperial forces on US forces. It's unclear if Churchill had not prepared Roosevelt in the way that he did, if the US would simply have focused on Japan or put a greater emphasis on Japan. But in fact, Roosevelt ends up agreeing with Churchill's Europe First strategy, that the primary opponent to defeat first and foremost is Hitler, and only in a second phase, Japan. So those are the two things he does behind the scenes. I do think he's also a really effective storyteller, the same way a lot of leaders were. Again, storytelling alone is not enough, but he threads this needle. He can walk this fine line between both establishing an absolute sense of urgency that this is a fight for survival, which in some ways it was not. A German invasion of the British islands would not have been effective. That's a pretty unanimous conclusion among military historians as well. So he sells it as a fight for survival, but, and this is the balancing act, it's a fight that Britain and its allies will eventually win. So there's this urgency, this dire need, but at the same time, it's a very realistic goal. And why I say that's a fine balance to strike is because early on, what they really need are weapons from the US. And so in order to get Lend-Lease and these other programs set up, you need to both sell to the American public that there's an absolute urgency here, but it's not going to go to waste because eventually, of course, we will win. That's what he's telling people. In that sense, there's a nice parallel actually to Zelensky. I think he did exactly the same thing in the early phases of the war to communicate the absolute urgency of the situation in Ukraine, but communicating in no uncertain terms that we will fight and we will win. Therefore, any weapons you send us will not go to waste.
Right. And, you mentioned that Churchill is often accused of the action fallacy because people only look at the speeches and sort of the more bombastic, blustery things that he's known for. But there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes where he's organizing a massive bureaucracy. And, a lot of times we sneer today at sort of lifelong politicians, and we sort of can sometimes lionize, an outsider from the political system who isn't going to be trapped and bogged down by bureaucracy. But when you're in a life or death struggle for civilization, world war, knowing which levers to pull and organizing a bureaucracy. And you talked about how just creating a system of how to give orders and how to write things down. And you compare that with Hitler, who you talked about earlier, who's just giving verbal orders that are contradicting each other, and he's just yelling things, and there's no organization, there's no system. Churchill also is taking in lots of information. He's reading newspapers. He's understanding how things are being talked about and how that affects the broader population. And I would say, like you said, from a storytelling perspective, he's capable of understanding a story that he doesn't believe in, right? And I think you pointed to his, I guess you would call it an alliance with the Soviet Union. Even though part of his story is hating communism, he recognizes that in order to win this war, sometimes you have to be a little bit flexible as a leader, and that's something that Hitler or someone who thinks like Hitler could never do.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's a book that came out just last year by Amanda Goodall. She's a leadership scholar from the UK, and her research shows that being a subject matter expert, so being competent and fluent in a specific subject matter, can make you a better leader in that area. She looks at, MBA teams that are coached by all-stars generally do better. Hospitals led by doctors generally do better. Universities led by academics generally do better by all the metrics that we can measure. And the same is true here. I mean, Churchill is fluent in governance and in modern military machinery. He had spent most parts of his adult life in government. He had held most ministerial positions in the government in England, and so on and so forth. So he understood which levers to turn in which way to make this work, and also when to rely on the expert opinions of others. And in Hitler, there's another kind of characteristic vignette is in Ian Kershaw's biography of Hitler. He relates this scene where in May of 1943, Hitler is meeting in his mountain retreat with some of the engineers behind the Me-262, so the first jet fighter. And this could have been a game changer if it had been operational earlier. And Hitler, in this meeting, on a whim, decides he wants it to be a bomber, not a fighter. And he just starts shouting at these engineers and his underlings that, I want a bomber, make it a bomber. And, it sets back the development of this very sophisticated, potentially game-changing weapon by several months. And then eventually, as these engineers are scrambling to figure out how to make this thing into a bomber after they've been designing a fighter for several years. And then in the end, he decides, no, let's make it a fighter anyway. And these types of interventions just don't work. They're going to set you back in a modern complex war where you have to integrate science and technology into a large military. And that doesn't happen, at least not to that degree, in Churchill's Britain.
The action fallacy at work there again. I'd like to change gears here and go to Toussaint Louverture. So this guy was I guess you would say, the driving force behind the Haitian Revolution, which is happening in the early 1800s, kind of mostly understood as a slave rebellion against the French Empire at that time, although it's a little more complicated than that, as you point out. I guess my question for you would be, could you explain sort of the broad strokes of the Haitian Revolution and how this leader, Toussaint Louverture, sort of fits into your concept of leadership?
Yeah, so he's one of the four leaders that I profile in my book, and certainly there are others one could profile as well. But I was interested in him because, this is what historians call the age of revolutions. So we have the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and revolutions across South America. So, with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the emergence of a middle class that's more educated, ideas around political liberalism, we get these revolutions kind of across Europe and the Americas. And one revolution that's rarely talked about is exactly as you say, the Haitian Revolution. It's the only successful slave revolt in history. And it was led by Toussaint Louverture, who was born an illiterate slave and became an influential revolutionary, military leader, and later also, kind of the man in charge of this territory, which had been, a big producer of sugar and coffee and France's most lucrative colony. So it was a territory that France very much wanted to hang on to, and that both Spain and Great Britain also got involved in. So really, Toussaint has to engineer a fight against the three most powerful European empires of the day. And interestingly, maybe before we get into the details, I mean, Haiti today is obviously in pretty dire circumstances. It's a country that has a lot of problems. And I think a large part of this goes back to the anger that is unanimously felt across France, Spain, Great Britain, a lot of European and American countries after this successful slave revolt, because it went so sharply against the belief in white supremacy, in the rights of whites to rule the world, that Haiti is essentially written off. It's saddled with this massive double debt by the French crown, and it's essentially cut off from the emerging global system. And I think a lot of there's been some leadership failures in recent times in Haiti as well, but let's say a lot of its history post-revolution was really difficult because of how the European powers treated them subsequently. There's a great piece in the New York Times in 2022 called "The Root of Haiti's Misery," which kind of lays out the devastating effect that these reparation payments that the French demanded of Haiti had on the long-term development of Haiti. So that's something worth looking into. And so how did he do this? I mean, Toussaint, similar to Churchill and some of these other leaders, he is a great communicator. He gives speeches and he writes letters that are inspiring, even if you read them today. But he also is an exceptionally effective administrator behind the scenes, kind of understands the complexities of the players who are involved, is willing to ally himself with one great power when it suits them, when they are fighting another one, is both willing to go on the offensive as a military leader, but also retreat when necessary and let the weather and the mosquitoes do the work for him. So a very flexible and very competent administrator. Maybe just one little detail. So D.G. Wright wrote this classic book about Napoleon in Europe a couple years ago, and he makes this point that Napoleon was exceptionally hardworking. And to underline this fact, Wright tells us that Napoleon dictated an average of 15 letters a day. That's a lot. Toussaint, according to contemporary observers, including French observers, dictated an average of 200 letters a day. So on top of being a military leader in the field, being a vocal, an inspiring speaker, he is orchestrating through his letters all kinds of things behind the scenes.
Yeah, so it's interesting there that we see some parallels starting to emerge where it seems like historical leaders who have success are able to kind of work behind the scenes quite a bit, and it's not just all about who yells the loudest and who does the most things, but there's, in Toussaint's case, it's writing all these letters and getting all the different racial groups and class groups on the island organized and kind of keeping in mind the bigger picture of, like you said, this new emerging global system. So he wants to be free of the French and establish Enlightenment values of natural rights for everybody on his side, but he also recognizes that the new country will fail if they aren't part of this global system. So he has to walk this balancing act, and he's aware of this when he's trying to tell his stories and when he's giving his speeches and writing his letters. And so understanding this storytelling aspect of history and understanding that not everything has to be the action fallacy, you can work behind the scenes, seems to be something that is emerging. But I would like maybe to do one more here and get a little of the female perspective on leadership, at least your thoughts on it. So Gertrude Bell is probably a person that not many folks know too much about. So maybe you could put her in a context in history and talk about her life and leadership style and kind of how that all fits in for you.
Yeah, so most people have probably heard of Lawrence of Arabia, who was famous even, in his own lifetime, but became, let's say, an epic leader after the 1962 movie Lawrence of Arabia, which Has a hefty dose of poetic license in it, I would say. But Lawrence is this classic heroic, action-oriented leader. He was a big fan of riding camels with a sword in one hand and a gun in the other, kind of leading from the front. But he himself admitted during his lifetime that the person most responsible for supporting the emerging Arab independence movement. So this is in the period during and after the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire is collapsing. And the question is, what's going to happen with this Mesopotamia and essentially what we today would term the Middle East. And Lawrence himself admits the person who does the most to support this Arab independence movement and ultimately the creation of an independent Arab nation is not him, but Gertrude Bell. And like many historical leaders, like Churchill, I think it's important not to idolize or romanticize her. Parts of her belief system, I think, are problematic. She was an anti-suffragette in her youth, for example. However, on this issue of Arab independence, she has a vision that I think is quite unique in this time period, where many Europeans still believed that ruling is a job that only Europeans can and should do well. And she was a remarkable woman in many ways, long before she becomes active in this Middle Eastern quagmire, if you will. She was the first woman to earn a first in modern history at Oxford. She was the first woman officer ever employed by British military intelligence. Two of her works on archaeology are still classics today. They were reprinted in 2008, 2013. And she undertook a series of treks through the deserts of this region between 1900 and 1913 that covered thousands of miles, unsupported by any government or any formal structures. So it's kind of very, very adventurous, very risky endeavors. But it gave her an intimate knowledge of the languages, of the cultures, and the geography of this region that she was later able to use to support the Arabs, in particular Faisal, who becomes the first king of Iraq, in creating a state for them.
I did want to ask, in what ways do you think Gertrude Bell was constrained as a leader? So obviously she's a woman in the early 1900s, and that's going to constrain what she is, the framework that she's working in as far as what she wants to accomplish. And you can also contrast that, like you do, with some of the things that she's interested in, right? She's an adventurer, and some of this freedom to operate seems like it's important for her. So kind of navigating this battle between constraints versus freedoms may say something about effective leadership. What do you think there?
She certainly was constrained, first and foremost, by the fact that she was a woman in what was very much a man's world. And with that said, if we are to believe what she wrote in her letters, she wrote quite a bit to her father and other family members, and these letters are all accessible. She seemed very happy to be in the background, not to be in the limelight. And later on, towards the end of her life, she dies in 1926. In the final years, she does get a lot of requests for interviews. There's some British journalists who figure out that, whenever anybody of importance travels to Baghdad, the first person they go visit is not King Faisal or any of the British commissioners, Percy Cox or Arnold Wilson. The first person everybody goes to see is Gertrude Bell, because she knows what's going on and she'll tell me what to do while I'm here. So she does get some requests for interviews, and she ignores all of them. She does not want any part in, being a public figure. So that's certainly part of her. But I think you don't need to be shy or kind of avoid the limelight to be an effective leader. I think that's more of a personal question. Churchill, for example, is very much in the spotlight. But again, it's not necessarily what he says in public that makes a difference in the war effort. It's what he does behind the scenes. And the same is true for Gertrude Bell. She's working behind the scenes. And unlike Churchill, she doesn't have this strong public persona.
One last question. In writing the book and obviously in working in business and leadership and history, what would you say are some of the big leadership lessons and takeaways and some of the broader themes that have emerged for you around this topic?
I think it's difficult to reduce leadership to, a one-size-fits-all formula. And so I'm wary of kind of bullet point-esque leadership recommendations, because very often it depends on the context. Different situations require a leader to do different things. I've talked a lot about how good leaders will build structures and engage in these communication campaigns behind the scenes, and that actually lays the groundwork for success. But if your house is on fire or the equivalent in your company or in your country, that's not the time to sit around and be deliberate and quiet. Then you probably need to get up and shout and wave your arms around wildly. So context will determine a lot in terms of what a leader can and should do. Nonetheless, there are a few things that I notice are true across all of the really successful leaders I've profiled in history. So one is that they're all very, very fluent in the context of their time. We talked about Churchill, lifetime in government. Bell knew this region better than anyone else. And the same is true for a lot of these effective leaders. So being fluent in the context of what it is you're doing, I think is critical. And the other thing is, what the good leaders I looked at tend to do is they tend to minimize rather than exaggerate or promote dramatic circumstances. And this is significant because it's actually these other leaders who tend to always find themselves in a crisis of their own making, or a crisis that they make worse through their actions. Those are the ones that the action fallacy tricks us into kind of examining, because they're more exciting, a lot more happened. But truly good leaders, of course, there will be some crisis moments. You can't avoid that, but they seem to have fewer of them than a lot of their contemporaries. And I think the third one aligns with what I've already said, is that they tend to invest a lot of energy in building cultures and structures within their teams or organizations or whatever they're leading that are kind of tailor-made to the specific challenges they face and the particular strengths that they find within their team. So I would say those three things.
All right. Well, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate some of the nuance you bring to a lot of these topics, and how there's not really a one-size-fits-all approach. I think we need more of that in society, probably. So, again, just want to say thanks for coming on and appreciate your time here.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways, of course, by leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for the email newsletter that I've been working on. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. As always, that's it for now.